Conservatism and Obituary by Ayn Rand.
Ayn Rand delivered the following talk at Princeton University in December of 1960. The debate she refers to is the Nixon-Kennedy debate.
Ladies and gentlemen, I shall begin by asking you to consider a hypothetical situation. If some science fiction dictator ordered men to hold an election with a new kind of secret ballot in which the thing kept secret were the identity of the issue, and people had to vote for or against a political system without knowing what it was or how it worked, you would say that this is a fantastic, preposterous farce. But suppose that such an election took place in a free country where people came voluntarily to vote for or against an unnamed political system without knowing its nature, without wanting to know, where those on one side did not have the courage to admit what it was that they were upholding, and those on the other side did not dare to announce what it was that they were destroying, and thus they cast their ballots, determining their future and the fate of a system that remained unknown, unnamed, undefended. What would you say about it? Don't say that it is a fantasy. It is history. You have lived through an election of that kind. There was only one issue, one political system at stake in the last presidential election, but it did not appear on any ballot, and it was not represented by either party. Yet everybody knew it, everybody voted for or against it, but nobody wanted to mention its name. Its name was capitalism. The candidates of both parties stressed the fact with which everybody seems to agree, that the world is facing a deadly conflict and that we must fight to save civilization. But what is the nature of that conflict? Like most of today's intellectual leaders, both candidates answered, it is a conflict between communism and what? Blank out. It is a conflict between two ways of life, they answered, the communist way and what? Blank out. It is a conflict between two ideologies, they answered. What is our ideology? Blank out. The truth which both candidates refuse to face and to admit is that the world conflict of today is the last stage of the struggle between capitalism and socialism, and that the whole world knows it. The most helplessly ignorant shopkeeper on any corner of any street on earth knows it in his own simple terms, though he is unable to discuss political theory. Any illiterate peasant knows it in any Russian-occupied country when he dies fighting in desperate bewilderment for his right to his scraggly patch of soil. Every American voter knew it in this past election, but the political leaders of both parties were the only ones who pretended not to see and who went through the shabby ritual of promising mankind free speech, free factories, free medicine, and free lunches, all to come from the American treasury, as if the masses of mankind were, in fact, the looting parasites of the socialist's fancy. We stand for freedom, said both candidates, and proceeded to declare what kind of controls, regulations, coercions, taxes, and sacrifices they would impose, what arbitrary powers they would demand, what social gains they would hand out to various groups without specifying from what other groups these gains would be expropriated. Neither party cared to admit that government control of a country's economy, any kind or degree of such control by any group for any purpose whatsoever, rests on the basic principle of socialism, the principle that man's life belongs to the state. A mixed economy is merely a semi-socialized economy, which means a semi-enslaved society, which means a country torn by irreconcilable contradictions in the process of gradual disintegration. Freedom, in a political context, means freedom from government coercion. It does not mean freedom from the landlord or freedom from the employer or freedom from the laws of nature which do not provide man with automatic prosperity. It means freedom from the coercive power of the state and nothing else. The world conflict of today is the conflict of the individual against the state, the same conflict that has been fought throughout mankind's history. The names change, but the essence and the results remain the same, whether you call it the individual against feudalism, or against absolute monarchy, or against communism, or fascism, or Nazism, or socialism, or the welfare state. If one upholds freedom, one must uphold man's individual rights. If one upholds man's individual rights, one must uphold his right to his own life, to his own liberty, to the pursuit of his own happiness, which means one must uphold a political system that guarantees and protects these rights, which means the politico-economic system of capitalism. Individual rights, freedom, justice, progress were the philosophical values, the theoretical goals, and the practical results of capitalism. No other system can create them or maintain them. No other system ever has or will. For proof, consider the nature and function of basic principles. For evidence, consult history and the present state of the different countries of Europe. The issue is not slavery for a good cause versus slavery for a bad cause. The issue is not dictatorship by a good gang versus dictatorship by a bad gang. The issue is freedom versus dictatorship. It is only after men have chosen slavery and dictatorship that they can begin the usual gang warfare of socialized countries. Today it is called pressure group warfare, over whose gang will rule, who will enslave whom, whose property will be plundered for whose benefit, who will be sacrificed to whose noble purpose. All such arguments come later and are in fact of no consequence. The results will always be the same. The first choice, and the only one that matters, is freedom or dictatorship, capitalism or socialism. That is the choice which today's political leaders are determined to evade. The so-called liberals are trying to put socialism over by stealth, without letting the country realize what road they are taking to what ultimate goal. And while such a policy is reprehensible, there is something much more reprehensible: the policy of the so-called conservatives, who are trying to defend freedom by stealth. If the liberals are afraid to identify their program by its proper name, if they advocate every specific step, measure, policy, and principle of socialism, but squirm and twist themselves into semantic pretzels with such euphemisms as the welfare state, the New Deal, the New Frontier, they still preserve a semblance of logic, if not of morality. It is the logic of a con man who cannot afford to let his victims discover his purpose. Besides, the majority of those who are loosely identified by the term liberals are afraid to let themselves discover that what they advocate is socialism. They do not want to accept the full meaning of their goal. They want to keep all the advantages and effects of capitalism while destroying the cause, and they want to establish socialism without its necessary effects. They do not want to know or to admit that they are the champions of dictatorship and slavery. So they evade the issue for fear of discovering that their goal is evil. Immoral as this might be, what is one to think of men who evade the issue for fear of discovering that their goal is good? What is the moral stature of those who are afraid to proclaim that they are the champions of freedom? What is the integrity of those who outdo their enemies in smearing, misrepresenting, spitting at, and apologizing for their own ideal? What is the rationality of those who expect to trick people into freedom, cheat them into justice, fool them into progress, con them into preserving their rights, and, while indoctrinating them with socialism, put one over on them and let them wake up in a perfect capitalist society some morning? These, ladies and gentlemen, are the so-called conservatives, or most of their intellectual spokesmen.
I was born in a welfare state, 'cause the 20th century people took it all away from